Good evening, everyone. Welcome to BRLSI this evening. It's a beautiful evening. I'm aware that you're giving up the possibility of a pint in the pub garden. So anyway, welcome. I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. But first of all, I'm just going to say that if there's a fire alarm, it's a real one, because we don't do practices on Thursday evenings. So if the fire alarm goes off, what we do is we go down the stairs and we assemble in Queen Square outside. You'll know where it is because we'll all be there together. Should the stairs be on fire, don't worry about it. There's another set of stairs just over there in number 18, and we'll be able to get down there. Of course, this isn't going to happen, but it's important that you should know that that's what we're going to do. This is actually a talk in a series about both science and the environment. And so I just thought I'd mention that we've got a few talks coming up in the coming weeks, which might interest you. So on Thursday, October the 3rd, Professor Tim Mays from the University of Bath is going to be talking about sustainable hydrogen for net zero. That may be something that interests some of you. Perhaps a bit closer here is to our topic tonight is that on the 31st of October, Dr. Ed Moody from the University of Bristol is going to be talking about the last universal common ancestor, LUCA, which is what we conjecture to be an important stage in the origin of life on Earth. A bit later, on November the 7th, Joe Barnes, Professor Joe Barnes from the University of the West of England, is going to be talking about urban air pollution and how to overcome it. And then on November the 20th, we're going to have a question and answer panel here in this room on COP29, the Conference of the Parties 29. This is the UN climate change negotiations. And that the panel here will coincide with the end stages of what's happening in Azerbaijan, and those of you who are concerned about the future of the planet may well be interested to come along and talk to some experts about the progress that is or isn't being made. So I think the take-home message from all of that is that there's plenty going on here at BRLSI to interest people like us. Keep an eye on the What's On section of the BRLSI website and the other ways that you have of keeping up with the BRLSI through social media. So tonight, we're being entertained, I'm sure, and informed by Dr. Ben Aldiss, who some of you may have already met earlier in the year when he gave a talk about wasp stings and how to avoid them as part of the BRLSI's offerings on National Insect Week. But tonight he's giving a talk on a quite different topic, which is that of alien invaders, and I'll leave him to explain to you what it's all about.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. If you did come to my last talk, you'll know that my second degree, my PhD, was on wasps. And in fact, I discovered what was later proved to be the alarm pheromone of wasps. One of my remits was to find out whether wasps had an alarm pheromone, and if so, what it was. And the second, which Rentokil were very interested in, was how to attract wasps away from jam factories and chocolate factories and fishmongers. So very varied work. Can you all hear me? Yeah. My first degree, though, was ecology. And in fact, I became a professional ecologist as well as a teacher and lecturer after a brief dalliance in the Royal Navy. And in fact, I went on eventually to lecture on conservation management at an agricultural college, and also I was an associate lecturer in animal physiology for the Open University, as well as for 8 years I was an expert advisor for the Heritage Lottery Fund in biodiversity and education. Okay, well, one of the things that really interests me is alien species. And because I lecture on cruise ships, I get to see quite a lot of alien species in the various places I go to. So I'm going to start by telling you a story which some of you might actually be familiar with. And we'll come back to it at the end. So 1 p.m. on the 1st of September, 1914, a tragic event took place. The death of 29-year-old Martha. Now, does anyone know who I might be talking about? Yes. Martha, the passenger pigeon. And it was particularly tragic, as we'll see. They were very beautiful birds. That's the male, and a male and female together. And I put together a few statistics just to blow your minds, basically. Because for thousands of years, possibly millions even, it was by far the most numerous bird on Earth. And in 1850, there were reckoned to be between 4 and 5 billion of them living in North America, which was the only place that they were found. And when you think that that's more than double the entire world human population at the time, you can get some idea as just to how numerous they were. And it was a nomadic pigeon, and it migrated. It needed to migrate to find enough food. It migrated from Canada right down to the southern United States and back again every year. And if you didn't know this, I think it will surprise you. The biggest flock ever recorded was 1 mile wide, 300 miles long, and took 14 hours to pass overhead. It contained about 3.5 billion birds, so most of the world population of these birds. And if they weighed around 0.5 kilo, which they did, that makes the total mass of the flock to be 1.75 million tons. And if you can't get your head around that, it's the weight of 145,000 double-decker buses. It's quite incredible. But 50 years or so later, they were extinct. And The passenger pigeon, as far as I know, has the unique distinction of being the only species of anything in the world for which we have an exact time and date of its extinction. The 1st of September, 1 p.m., the 1st of September, 1914. So it really should be an iconic species for conservationists because it really underlines the importance of looking after our world. And it's quite incredible that such a numerous organism could become extinct so relatively quickly. Anyway, I'll come back to that later. So what exactly is an alien species? Well, it's a species that is taken to a different country or even habitat for which it's not effectively designed. It's not adapted for that habitat or country. And it's usually as a result of human intervention. And the problem alien species find is exemplified by this food web. You probably can't see it very clearly, but it doesn't really matter. All it's showing is that food webs are relatively complex. They start with producers, the plants that photosynthesize, and those are eaten by herbivores, which are eaten by carnivores and omnivores, and then you get top predators. And this is a food web from the southwestern deserts of the United States. If you were an alien species, you'd have to somehow slot into that complex web. And slotting in to a completely novel ecosystem is no mean feat because you've got to somehow compete, and you've got to compete effectively to be able to survive. And of course, being an alien species, you won't have any experience of any of the predators in that food web, any of the competitors, and very often the environmental factors will be different too. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that roughly 1% of any alien species actually end up being successful competitors. Most of them don't survive very long at all. The difference between an alien species and an invasive one is really what I've just said. An invasive species is one that actually can compete successfully for whatever reason. And I'm illustrating it by these familiar birds. The chicken, of course, is very familiar to virtually everybody in the world. And not surprisingly, because it is arguably the most successful organism in the world. As we speak, there are roughly 7 chickens to every human being in the world. And when you think that every day huge numbers are killed to eat, you can see that over the course of a year, enormous numbers of chickens exist somewhere or other in the world. But in Britain, they are alien species. They are not invasive. We all know that if chickens get out into the wild, they don't last very long. And that's because they are not adapted to our ecosystems. So they are alien species in our setup. The bird at the bottom left, you probably know, some of you, is the rose-ringed parakeet or ring-necked parakeet. In fact, that was the first thing I wrote an article about when I was nature correspondent for the European newspaper. I don't know if any of you subscribed to that, but it was, I think, the first all-color broadsheet, and you could buy it all over the world. And I wrote an article about the rose-ringed parakeet because at the time my family and I were living in Brussels, and Brussels was where somebody let them out of a cage. And since then, they've been spreading all over Europe and into Britain. And if you live anywhere or have lived anywhere near London, you will be very familiar with them. They are definitely becoming an invasive species because they can cope very, very well in our surroundings. And that's not perhaps surprising when you think that the northern part of their range, their normal range, is towards Nepal and those parts of India where they're very used to relatively low temperatures in the winter and quite high rainfall totals as well. The one at the bottom right is the collared dove. And that is effectively an extender. It has extended its range through no help from us at all. It has just naturally extended from the Middle East round about the 1920s up till now, where they're very common in Britain. But in the year I was born, 1954, there were a pair of them nesting in Cromer on the North Norfolk coast, where I come from. And bird watchers flocked to see them because they were so unusual. But now, of course, they're very common all over Britain. Why are invasive species, where they do occur, so successful? They're very good competitors, especially on islands. Now, islands and mountains are another couple of topics that I talk about. And islands particularly fascinate me because they very often have endemic species on them. And these endemic species are usually very well adapted to their small ecosystem, but not very well adapted to any competition that might reach them from somewhere else. A very good example of that, of course, is the dodo on Mauritius. Apparently dodos, which effectively were meter-high flightless pigeons, apparently they just stood around as sailors clubbed them to death. They didn't even try to escape. They didn't know about predators. And their eggs and chicks were eaten by rats and pigs. So an invasive species is very good at competing. They're very adaptable. If they're animals, they're often omnivores, which makes sense when you think about it. If you're going to join a novel ecosystem, it helps if you've got a choice of foods. And if they're plants, they often have rhizomes. I don't know how many botanists or gardeners there are here, but you'll probably know that a rhizome is a horizontal underground stem, which can at intervals and does put up vertical shoots. So effectively it forms a clone, and that patch can radiate out, sometimes for huge distances. You only have to look at bracken, for instance, on a Welsh hillside. Most of those huge tracts of bracken have probably originated many years ago from a single frond that branched out through rhizomes. In fact, I've often wondered why more plants don't have rhizomes. It's such an effective strategy. They often have a high reproductive rate, and that makes sense too. If you only produce a very few offspring a year, then even if you can sort of cope in the novel ecosystem, the chances that your offspring are going to be killed very quickly are high. And so you're probably not going to survive as a race. And sometimes, not always, there are few or no predators, parasites, or diseases. If the organisms that have been introduced for whatever reason, whether accidentally or deliberately, have come without a parasite load or without disease, then they're unlikely to have the right sorts of parasites or the right diseases to infect them in that novel ecosystem. And sometimes the predators that do exist in these novel ecosystems don't quite know how to cope with these interlopers. I'm now going to talk about some different examples, some of which will be familiar to you, others possibly not. The rabbit, I'm sure most of you know about this, and certainly when I taught in schools, this was always on the biology curriculum. This deliberate introduction of the rabbit in 1788, it appears that possibly on the ship that Arthur Phillip came in the first fleet. Possibly they had rabbits on board then. The rabbits initially didn't survive very well because there was actually a natural predator in Australia. I don't know if any of you know which one it was. I'll show a picture of it in a minute. But this photo from about the turn of the 20th century shows actually an experimental island off the coast of Australia where they were seeing, first of all, how quickly rabbits multiplied and then what effect myxomatosis would have if it was introduced, because that was the biological control agent that actually made the difference eventually. Wombats are strange creatures, and they still are having real problems with rabbits, even though the rabbit population in Australia has decreased a lot. Wombats just can't compete with them. They have very few offspring per year. They spend 16 hours a day asleep, and they don't move very fast. So rabbits, wherever rabbits are, wombats basically don't get to the choicest food first. And this is the predator. There are 6 species of quoll, and the eastern quoll is actually extinct on the mainland of Australia now, largely because when rabbits were first introduced, the Australians killed as many quolls as they could because they wanted the rabbits to be able to hunt and to eat. But the eastern quoll was actually quite good at catching rabbits. These ones are on an island. I can't remember which island, some of you might know, but it's an island off the coast of Australia where the few remaining ones are breeding quite successfully. But when they were first introduced, as I said, in 1788, rabbits didn't do very well, but gradually they did better and better, especially when the quolls were killed off. In fact, they did so well eventually. Initially, I'd put on that first slide that some were introduced to Geelong some years later. Apparently 24 were introduced then with the specific remit to provide a breeding population so that they could be hunted. Well, they got completely out of hand. So much so, in fact, that they spread like wildfire across the whole of Australia, and the government finally decided to do something about it, but it was pretty late. As you can see, that's the western coast of Australia. And this was, it took 6 years to create this fence at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, a 2,000-mile long rabbit-proof fence. And in those days, this was 1907, I think it was finished, it cost £250,000. And it successfully prevented the rabbits in this part of Australia from reaching this bit. But what a huge cost in all sorts of terms to pay for the introduction of this invasive species. History doesn't relate as to who footed the bill for this fence. I'm sure the government did, but whether they tried to charge any of the culprits, I don't know. The prickly pear cactus, another you might well be familiar with. Certainly if you go to the Mediterranean on your holidays, you will see them in an invasive state in places. You probably know, certainly if you're a botanist, you'll know that cacti, true cacti, are found in the Americas. Any cactus found anywhere else in the world shouldn't really be there. Prickly things that live in places like Africa tend to be euphorbias, but the true cacti come from the Americas. And this one, Opuntia monocantha, again, was deliberately introduced by Arthur Phillip. Incidentally, Arthur Phillip, who became the first governor of New South Wales, died in Bath, as some of you probably know, in 1814. And the prickly pear was introduced actually as a source of cochineal. The cochineal scale insect is the source of that red dye that used to be used. I don't think it is as much these days. There are more synthetic ones, but cochineal was very sought after in those days. And the prickly pear cactus was a good source of it. It was also introduced because it forms a very thorny and effective fence. That's one of my sons, actually. He came with me on a recent lecture cruise, and this is Alicante, the castle in Alicante. And that shows a very well-developed Opuntia. And you can imagine a whole lot of those together can form quite an impenetrable mass. And they did in Australia. In fact, from the time of their introduction, around the time I've suggested there, to around the mid-20th century, there were huge tracts of land totally rendered unfarmable by these cacti. In fact, I think it's something like 100,000 square miles was actually overrun by these cacti, and farmers actually had to abandon their farms, and these cacti actually crushed their farm buildings and made it absolutely impossible to farm. So these were brought over from Brazil. Somebody had the bright idea of bringing in a biological control agent, because if you have a problem with an invasive species, one of the first things you have to do, or should do, is to go back to the source of the plant, in this case, and find what its natural control agents are. And this little moth, and it's not very big at all, is called Cactoblastis cactorum, literally meaning cactus destroyer. And it does a very good job. Here are a lot of the larvae, the caterpillars eating away the surface layers of one of those cactus pads. And this shows contemporary photos in around 1925. This was when the cactus moth was introduced, and 3 years later, it's effectively eradicated the prickly pears from that same place. And that made a huge difference. Of course, the problem with biological control can be that you bring the control agent in, it does its job, but then what does it do? And we'll see an example in a few minutes of what can happen. The giant reed, again, some of you will be familiar with this, Arundo donax, both words for reed, one in Latin, one in Greek. And this has been deliberately introduced as a biofuel. It is considered to be the most efficient biofuel of any. It grows incredibly fast. It's one of the fastest growing species of plant in the world. It's a C3 plant, not a C4 plant in terms of its photosynthesis, but it has various adaptations that make it as fast growing as some C4 plants like sugarcane and certain bamboos. It grows very tall. This is very contemporary because this was me 2 weeks ago in Greece, and I got my wife to take a photo just to show how tall this grows. It is very resistant to any form of herbivore. Its leaves have a high silica content, and also there are various toxins in the leaves, and not many things eat it. It is also very good at coping with fire. It's very flammable, obviously being a biofuel, you'd expect that. It's very flammable, but because it's got deep rhizomes up to 1 meter under the ground, it can regenerate very quickly after a fire. This one is not nearly so important in the world. The horse chestnut leaf miner, Cameraria oridella. And I was fascinated when I first saw the effects of this. I'm sure you've all seen it now because hardly any horse chestnut tree escapes this moth. And it's the one that produces leaf mines. That's the actual moth and its little caterpillar, tiny little thing. And those are the telltale signs on the leaves. Each one of those mines is the home of one of those caterpillars. And one of those moths will lay 20 to 40 eggs per leaf or leaflet of the horse chestnut. And they can have up to 5 generations a year as well. The good thing about it is that this isn't a hugely destructive pest because the horse chestnut survives, it produces nuts, and it grows again the year after. But undoubtedly, this moth causes an effect. It reduces the vigor of the tree, so it doesn't grow as quickly. Now, it's called oridella. That name rung a bell with me because some years ago, when my 4 children were younger, we used to drive all over Europe on camping holidays in the summer. And quite recently, my wife and I were driving through Albania. I don't know if any of you have done that, but the AA recommended that we didn't drive through Albania. We didn't actually have a choice. But in North Macedonia, as it's now called, and the Albanian border, there's a lake called Lake Ohrid, which straddles both countries. And I thought, why is this moth called oridella? And it turns out that that was the only place it was found for many years, for some reason. And then it started to spread. So there is Lake Ohrid, there's Albania and North Macedonia. And this shows the extent of its spread. So in 1984 to 85, it was restricted to just around the lake there. And then these different colors show the spread of it in subsequent years. So 2005 to 2006, well, 2003, it got into East Anglia, 2005, and then 2007, it got to our part of the world. And it's not known quite why it's spreading so fast. It has obviously got something to do with modern transport because we're far more mobile these days, and it's relatively easy to accidentally transport some horse chestnut from one place to another. But there must be some genetic component as well, apparently, from what I can see in the literature, that a strain has developed that is more likely to spread. The moths are more likely to fly some distance. So it has become invasive, but it's not a huge pest. This one is becoming a huge pest. The harlequin ladybird was deliberately introduced to the Netherlands from Southeast Asia, because, as you will know, the Netherlands are a center for hothouse crops. And as time went on in the 20th century and competition between growers intensified, they needed something that was better than our native ladybirds to deal with some of the pests that were attacking their glasshouse crops. And somebody suggested the harlequin ladybird because it was voracious. Now, it's called a harlequin because it comes in lots of different colorways. Here's a female and the male of the same species, but clearly very different colors. And this shows a range of the different colors you can get. In the United States, they are very frequently found around the time of the end of October, when you'd be celebrating, can't remember the name of it now. What happens on the 31st of October? Halloween. They call it the Halloween ladybug, because it's entered America as well. And you will have seen, I'm sure, that if you've got clusters of ladybirds in your home, particularly over winter, very often they'll be the harlequin ones nowadays. They tend to cluster in large groups to hibernate. Now, the problem with the harlequin ladybird is that, yes, it's a brilliant predator and does a very good job in Holland and other places at keeping down scale insects to a certain extent, but certainly aphids. The trouble is, when it runs out of aphids, it eats the larvae of native ladybirds. And that is potentially a really big problem. I don't know if you've noticed, but I certainly have, that there are far fewer two-spot ladybirds around in recent years. And I'm sure that's partly due to the harlequin ladybird. And this shows the life cycle, the eggs, the young larvae. They eat aphids just as the adults do. And then there's a pupa and the newly eclosed adult there before it's hardened and its colors have come through. So that's an example of a biocontrol agent that has backfired effectively, and it's now reached Britain. Well, in fact, it reached Britain a long time ago. It's a very strong flyer, and I certainly remember, I suppose about 10 years ago now, on the North Norfolk coast when we lived there, one summer there was a sudden invasion of them to such an extent you couldn't actually stay on the beach because they were just everywhere. Something very different now, the giant African snail. And I've put the Latin names in because I'm fascinated by nomenclature, and I just thought it might be interesting to let you know, if you didn't already, that because until relatively recently, zoologists and botanists barely talked to each other, they had different rules for nomenclature, and still do, I think. Actually, I'm not sure. Somebody might be able to tell me that, but certainly zoological nomenclature allows you to call an organism the same name twice or even 3 times. So the wren, for instance, the subspecies we have in Britain is Troglodytes, Troglodytes, Troglodytes. The St. Kilda wren is Troglodytes, Troglodytes, kildaensis. But in botany, you are not allowed to use the same name twice. So no plant has the same name twice like that. And incidentally, you can call an animal the same name as a plant. So the dunnock, for instance, is prunella, and so is the plant self-heal. They're both prunella. So this is one species of giant African snail, and I'm using this as an example because it's fascinating from the point of view, as you possibly knew, snails are hermaphrodite, so they have both male and female reproductive organs. So they both have to come together to mate, but they both then lay eggs. So even though they've got a reputation for being fairly slow and ponderous, they can reproduce to an enormous rate, especially in tropical countries where these sorts of snails can survive. Of course, they can't survive in the wild in our country, but in places like Hawaii, they certainly can. That's another view of one. And this is another species that it doesn't have the sort of tiger stripes to the same extent, but it's still a big snail, and they weigh up to 0.5 kilo. So in places like Hawaii, where they're not native, they reproduce to a huge extent, and apparently you can tell when one has died because it just lies there rotting in the sun. Nothing eats it, and they stink. And of course, they eat a lot of plants. So somebody thought, right, what are we going to do about the giant African snail in Hawaii? It's getting out of control. And somebody from another of the United States, Florida, said, I know just the chap for the job, the rosy wolf snail. Now, this is another big snail. It's not nearly as big as the giant African snail, but it is big and it's fast, relatively fast, and it's totally carnivorous. It feeds on snails. So what a brilliant idea. Introduce that to Hawaii and the problems will be over. No, they won't, because this snail, given the choice of a big snail, probably much bigger than itself, or a little snail, it'll go for the little ones. And there are lots, or were lots, of little snails called Hawaiian tree snails. Notice they're called Achatinella. The giant African snail is Achatina. Well, Achatinella means a little one of those, effectively. Of course, they're totally unrelated, and these are very much smaller. There were, I think, 24 recognized species of these on the Hawaiian Islands, but at least 8 of them are now extinct as a direct result of the rosy wolf snail. And you've probably guessed it, the giant African snail is still doing well on Hawaii. They are beautiful, those little snails. The honeybee. Well, you're all very familiar with that. But do you know the story of its introduction to Brazil in 1956? It was reckoned by apiarists in South America that, yes, their honeybees were okay, but they got up quite late in the morning and went to bed quite early at night, and they didn't work very hard. And so these apiarists looked in envy at the African ones, which got up very early, went to bed late, and were incredibly effective gatherers of nectar and turning it into honey. The one drawback was they were quite vicious. So somebody decided to import 26 African queens to South America and do a controlled experiment, well, set of experiments over a number of years to try and breed in the efficiency to the South American ones without the viciousness. But then somebody accidentally let the 26 queens out into the wild, and they did their own breeding experiments. And from that time onwards, they effectively took over. They were so effective at competing with the indigenous ones. It's the same species, it's just they were just different strains, that they have been moving at 100 kilometers a year northwards ever since. I think they reached about the mid-United States, and for some reason they haven't spread too much further north. Presumably they require rather warmer conditions, but they are incredibly unreliable bees. They are very good at making honey, but they are very liable to attack. And there have been lots of harrowing stories of tethered animals being stung to death by bees because people didn't realize there was a colony nearby, and hence the African killer bee. Something very different now, the Nile perch. This, as its name suggests, is indigenous to certain parts of the Nile, but certainly not to a lot of the African lakes and other rivers. But somebody who knew about this perch thought it would be a jolly good idea to introduce it to some of these lakes and rivers, because if you catch one, the village food problem is over for a few days. They are huge, but you can imagine that to get to that size, they've got to eat an awful lot, and it's other fish usually. It's not so much plant material. Well, a perch we have in Britain are carnivores, largely. So this is a huge problem, and it is causing, apparently, certain species to near extinction. Much tamer, but still a huge problem. Japanese knotweed and purple rhododendron. Now, the rhododendron, as I've said, I'm fascinated by nomenclature, literally means rose tree. Presumably when people first saw them in southern Europe or the Himalayas, for instance, you'd round this corner in a rocky landscape and see what looks like a huge tree full of roses. So hence rhododendron. These were introduced to Britain largely to big estates because they look very impressive if you've got a huge garden. That's knotweed, and so is that. And you can tell just by looking at it that it's got rhizomes. And those rhizomes can be found to a depth of at least 1 meter, so very, very difficult to dig out. And if you dig them up and you inadvertently chop them into pieces, each piece is capable of starting again. And they are so effective, they can even push up through tarmac. They are so effective, and they're causing so many millions of pounds worth of damage in Britain that certainly when we moved down here from Norfolk in 2019, we had to actually state whether or not the property we were selling had Japanese knotweed on it or not, or even whether neighbors had it. There had to be a disclaimer. The purple rhododendron is different. It doesn't die down like the Japanese knotweed does. It's a woody species, as you know, and it does look beautiful in May and June. But it's got evergreen leaves, which are very effective at shielding the light from plants that could grow underneath. Yes, they tend to they grow in acid soils, but they tend to make the soils even more acidic the longer they live. So they reduce the competition below where they're growing, and they can spread remarkably quickly. And getting rid of it is a real pain. This was in Norfolk before I moved down here, and that's somebody working on an estate, the Holcombe estate, I think. And it just shows how difficult it is to get rid of. The Asian hornet. My research was on wasps and hornets, and so this is a particular interest to me. That's the Asian hornet, or the yellow-footed hornet, as it's sometimes called. It's smaller than the European one, the one we are used to, but it specializes on honeybees. And there's one about to dismember a honeybee. That's the nest, and it makes a big nest, usually quite high up in a tree. And on the island of Jersey, they're having huge problems with them. On one of the talks I gave recently, 2 people from Jersey came to me at the end of the talk and said how difficult it was becoming in places on Jersey, because I think last year they had something like 70 nests on that small island, 70 that they discovered. They're very beautiful nests, but the hornets sting quite readily. The radius that their alarm pheromone seems to operate over is greater than the 3 meters that I discovered for Vescula vulgaris and Germanica. It's probably nearer 5 or even closer to 10. So if you move vigorously, particularly if you jar the branch that it's on and you're within about 5 meters or so of the nest, you're very likely to get a mass attack. So there is actually an app that you can get. I've got it on my phone, the Asian Hornet app. And if you find an Asian hornet, even just an individual worker, you should alert that app. Lantana camara, one of my favorite garden plants. And I can say that because here in our country, it's not invasive. What I like about it is the flowers change color. And so you can get 3 different colors in the same flower head. And they are very, very attractive to Lepidoptera and other long-tongued insects. And the berries are numerous and very attractive to birds, so they can be spread very easily. So in Mediterranean type climates, this is becoming an invasive pest. And this was a little bit of footage I took in Sicily, showing a hummingbird hawk moth pollinating. Another insect that I found on my travels, the moment I got off a ship in Gibraltar, I saw a sign warning against these, the pine processionary moth. This is the actual sign on a tree close to the docks in Gibraltar, saying don't touch them, and especially be careful if you've got dogs, because the hairs are very, very irritating. They come out of the caterpillars very easily. They blow around in the wind. They're called processionary moths because once the caterpillars have stripped a particular pine tree of all its leaves, they troop off one behind the other to find some more food. And they also troop off to bury themselves under the ground to pupate, and they follow each other like that. They're quite big caterpillars, they're the size of your finger. And in fact, when we lived in Belgium for 9 years, and there was one summer where the army were called out in the south of Belgium because there were so many of these things. They were crossing the road in huge processions and cars were skidding on them and people were getting terrible allergic reactions around their eyes. And so the army came out with flamethrowers. And when they're feeding, the caterpillars live communally in a web of silk or a tent of silk, and they weave their hairs into the silk. When they change their skin, their hairs come out and they weave them into the silk. And on a warm summer's day with a breeze, those hairs blow around. This is very different, and I'm coming towards the end now of my talk. The Easter Island enigma. Well, we think of invasive species being a fairly modern thing, but Easter Island was colonized, it's reckoned, in about the 12th century by Polynesians who amazingly navigated across the Pacific in their dugouts and found Easter Island, which apparently was a forested in those days and had presumably lots of very interesting endemic species. Being so far from the mainland, it belongs to Chile, and look, you can see how far it is. It's about 3,000 kilometers. No, more than that, actually. Yeah, a long way. And you'll know, if I don't know if any of you have been there, I haven't, but the Rapa Nui tribes built these amazing statues. They built them in the volcanic highlands and then rolled them on logs down to the coast. And they're called moai, those statues. And apparently they were to ward off evil spirits or to stop other people colonizing their island. But it seems that the Polynesian rat was probably largely responsible for getting rid of many of the endemic species of the time. It's an omnivore, as rats tend to be, and it was very, very successful on Easter Island, killing small birds, small mammals, eating eggs, etc. And then the humans did the rest, because they chopped down all the trees to make canoes, to roll their statues around with, etc. And eventually made it inhospitable. So by the 17th century, there were only something like 200 of these people left. But this character, this species, apparently was a major culprit. And now this one, possibly my favorite invasive species, because it, as far as I know, does no harm whatsoever. But the story behind it, if you didn't know it, is very interesting. Senecio squalidus is found very rarely in parts of Europe. It's not a common plant at all. My wife and I have seen it in its very natural habitat, which is the slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily. It was introduced by this chap, Francesco Campani, and a friend of his in 1700 to Badminton Estate. And then it did quite well there, as long as it was planted in the right place. And so some seeds were taken to the Oxford Botanic Garden. Hence, as it became commoner, it was called the Oxford ragwort. Now, you all know the common ragwort because we have lots of it in our country, and it grows in meadows. Well, the Oxford ragwort doesn't. It grows, it couldn't be less like a meadow. It grows in very stony, rocky places, particularly with loose screen. It looks very like the normal ragwort, though. But it's got these little black markings on the bracts. And that's where it's normally found, on the slopes of Etna. And this, I took a photo as I was heading out on one of my lecture cruises of Sicily as we were going over, and that's the plume of smoke from Etna coming through the clouds. And that's where it started in Britain. And from the Oxford Botanic Garden, it spread because wherever it found a substrate that it could, that was similar to its natural substrate, for instance, the rocky surfaces of Oxford University buildings, it could thrive. And then it found Oxford railway station. And of course, the ballast that railway lines are on is absolutely almost a carbon copy of the sorts of substrate that it prefers on the sides of mountains. So from there, it has spread all over the railway network in Britain and Europe and other parts of the world. So it's no longer a rarity as it was in the wild. It's very common, but to my knowledge, doesn't really do any harm at all. You can see it at Bath railway station growing on the tracks. So what can we do about these alien invaders? Well, the trouble is they're often superbly adapted to compete, as you probably gathered from the ones I've shown. So they're the ones that can actually get into a novel ecosystem and do well. Others, perhaps they're not as well adapted, but find themselves in an ecosystem that lacks natural predators. The rabbit in Australia, for instance. Okay, the quoll is a bit of a problem, but actually there aren't many things that can tackle a rabbit in Australia even today. The cane toad, actually, this is a sort of side issue. The cane toad, people say, why didn't you speak about the cane toad? Well, there are so many invasive species I could have talked about. But the cane toad is causing a problem to the remaining quolls in Australia because quolls will attack and eat cane toads and then they get poisoned and usually die. Well, if you can stop organisms entering a country, then obviously that's the best defense, but it's so difficult. On the cruise ships that I go on, it's the numbers of times I see passengers, in inverted commas, on the cruise ship that shouldn't be there. For instance, we took a pied wagtail we picked up in Madeira all the way across to the Caribbean, poor thing. It survived on the ship quite well, but when it reached St. Lucia, I'm sure it wouldn't have lasted long. And of course, birds need a mate, so it's no good just taking one. Taking an insect of certain sorts is different though. The Asian hornet, you only need a hibernating queen who'd already mated to leave the ship, which she did in Bordeaux in 2004 in France. She then sets up a colony. At the end of that year, 500 virgin queens are produced and an equal number of males. Okay, they're interbreeding, but they then set up colonies the year after, and that's why they've spread all over the place. So any female organism that's carrying eggs or young is potentially a source of an invasive or an invasion. You can import natural predators if you haven't been able to stop these organisms, but that can often backfire once the control has proved effective, as we saw with the harlequin ladybird. So, extinction of specialized or less well-adapted native species is more or less inevitable, especially on islands. The smaller the island, the more likely it is, and the lower the island. Mountains are a different matter. If you ever come to one of my talks on mountains, I'd talk in more detail about that. So to finish off, back to the passenger pigeon. It was superbly adapted to this social, fast-moving lifestyle. So what caused its ultimate extinction? Well, you've guessed it. We did. And we are a very, very successful invasive species for many of the reasons that we've just looked at. Thank you very much.
Questions? You happy to answer some questions?
Of course, yes, yes, if I can.
Thank you. That was incredibly interesting.
Good.
I was wondering, do you have any examples of a invasive species that has been introduced into a place by a malicious actor? So actually somebody acting maliciously, so different from the Asian example.
I probably could think of one. At the moment I can't, but I'm pretty certain it has happened, yes. Does anyone else know of one?
Well, I suppose you could consider myxomatosis to be an invasive species in Australia.
Yes, yes, but I suppose it was introduced with the best of intentions, wasn't it, to control the rabbits?
A rabbit might not think so.
No. No, but then
Yeah.
the various biological control agents cause those sorts of problems with the things they're controlling. So I'm sorry, I can't think at the moment, but I'm almost certain I do know. That's going to bug me for a while. Any other questions?
No.
To what I haven't really got the sense from your talk of to what extent we still do deliberately introduce species into different ecosystems, or if we don't, which I get the sense we don't because we've learned a lot of lessons, when was the time when we kind of stopped, or did it just happen gradually over many years?
It has been quite a gradual thing, but horticulturalists especially are to blame for a lot of this, because of course gardeners are always looking for new and exotic plants, and when they're introduced, the last thing you want on a new plant, if you're a horticulturalist, is any herbivore or disease-causing organism. So you make sure that the specimens that come to your country are disease-free and herbivore-free. So then when they do go into gardens, and lo and behold, sometimes they escape and they prove to be very good competitors, then there's nothing initially to control them. But I suppose it's been in the last, 30 years that ecologists particularly have woken up to well, I think ecologists knew a long time before that, but the general community have woken up to the idea that it's not always a good thing to introduce something novel, because you never know what might happen if it gets out of control. The Duke of Bedford with his grey squirrels, for instance. You know, nobody knew that they were going to be such a problem. Incidentally, I don't know how many of you have noticed the sycamore trees all over the place have got big dead branches on them this year. I contacted the Forestry Commission plant disease person because I was worried about it, and I hadn't heard, nobody had been speaking about it, and I noticed this back in early August. And she got back to me saying it's squirrel damage. If it is, that's pretty amazing, because I certainly didn't notice it last year. Did any of you? This year, but it's not just around here. I took a train journey to London and it was all over the place, thousands upon thousands of trees, all with huge dead bits on, all sycamore or field maple. And I just can't believe that it's learned behavior suddenly and that there are enough squirrels to do that. But
Actually, I was talking to a tree surgeon we had the other day, and he'd noticed this, and he thought it might be due to the ash dieback and the squirrels migrating
oh, what you
or
mean?
between trees. So an extra load because of the ash dieback. I mean, I don't know whether that's the correct solution or not.
Well, the expert I spoke to said that her mammal friends in the Forestry Commission said that because they're acers, these sycamores and field maples, they do have a sap that may not be as good as the sugar maple, but is attractive to squirrels. So I don't know why they would go for ash particularly. I haven't noticed squirrels attacking ash trees particularly, but anyway, to me it looks more than just squirrel damage, but if it is squirrel damage, it's quite good news because it means the sycamore trees aren't going to completely die. Anyway, I don't know if that goes some way to answering your question. Oh, incidentally, the grey squirrel, I don't know if you know, is also a problem in parts of northern Italy. Well, one particular part of northern Italy where Nutella is made. And the squirrel is a real pest in their hazelnut groves.
Just quickly, are you saying that new species are still introduced into
This country, for example?
Yes, but probably not. It's probably unwitting because people don't realize the dangers if they escape. Yeah.
Yeah, plants have been, as you say, been moving around the world for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And two great drivers are colonialism, going right back to the Romans and to the modern times. But war actually moves a lot of plants around. And a very topical thing, in the last Lebanese war, when Israel invaded Lebanon, 2 years later, they had heavy rains, and you could see where all their tanks went because there was a daisy grew all along the tank tracks. And this is a concept developed by an American called synantropes, camp followers. And they can actually pinpoint all the different camps in the southern United States where fighting was by the unique flora.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Actually, Charles, it doesn't even need war for tanks to move plants around. There are quite a few plants that follow tank tracks in Britain, particularly on Salisbury Plain. But what I was going to say actually before was that there are, to answer the previous question, there are huge numbers of alien plants being brought in for horticulture at the moment, but large numbers of passengers coming with them. So we all know about tree ferns always bring passengers, various ferns and bryophytes come in with tree ferns, innocuous aliens often, but there are some fairly worrying plant aliens coming in as well. Something that I really that worries us a lot is the most invasive plants at the moment, I think, in this country are probably some aquatic species. You didn't mention aquatic species. So Crassula helmsii, the New Zealand pygmy weed, is a terrible problem. If you get it around a pond, it will just smother all the vegetation around the pond and exclude everything else. And that's tragically often introduced unwittingly by people who are very keenly digging a wildlife pond, and then they go to a nursery or a supplier and they buy native plants that have been grown to plant around their wildlife pond. And I think all the times I've found New Zealand pygmy weed in sort of south of Bath, I live in Walton, have all been around small wildlife ponds that people have planted up, and they've unwittingly brought in Crassula helmsii from the nursery. And then it just smothers the edge of the pond. If you want to see it in vast quantities, and some of the reservoirs over on the Quantocks have it as just like green snow all the way around the margins of the ponds. It's smothering all the other plants that would otherwise, native plants that would grow there. Yeah, so and some of the most expensive aquatics for removal at the moment are probably expensive aliens are probably aquatic ones.
Is Azolla.
Azola's is a strange one. That's the water fern. So it's a sort of boom and bust plant. Sometimes it completely smothers a ditch, and then it will exclude the light from underneath the water. So it will kill the water plants, which means all the insects and invertebrates that depended on the plants in the water will struggle as well, die. But then it will just disappear. And it's frost tender as well. But the worst one, probably in Somerset at the moment, is the floating pennywort. Sorry, I've gone completely blank. Hydroclotylene ranunculoides, which is clogging ditches. And the Environment Agency works really hard to drag it out of ditches and pile it up on sides. But they always miss little bits, and then it will reinvade incredibly quickly. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
I might comment there that actually I think that quite a lot of water plants might well be considered naturally invasive. That's how they grow.
Actually, I have a
Hi,
question. I've got them.
Just a quick question. There's a recent documentary on Easter Island. I don't know whether anybody else has seen it. I'd be surprised if you hadn't. But the suggestion there was that there was a Polynesian population that lived quite sustainably on the island, and it wasn't until the Europeans made an appearance that everything went to pot.
What, because of
Well,
the
diseases they brought in goats and pigs, and they're the things that deforested the island, not the islands themselves. And the thing that I found very interesting was that the statues, the positions of the statues around the island correlated with fresh spring water locations. And they weren't actually there necessarily. Well, they could have been used for rituals, for religious rituals, because water, obviously life-giving, fresh water, but they were markers for people to locate fresh water sources.
What's the best just to mark where the water is?
Well, I mean, the whole...
Interesting. It is still a bit of a mystery, though, isn't it?
It's, well, I accept that, but there is a correlation wherever you find these statues. I think the people that did the survey teams that did the work were suggesting that over, I don't know how many years the islands were occupied. I got the impression it was for thousands of years.
I gathered it was
it's no 800, 1200. Okay, so 800 years, say, before Europeans got there. And they did the calculations for the number of statues. I think, I can't remember the numbers now, but most of them hadn't been actually erected because they'd carved them. And the ones they had moved, they'd only erect maybe 3 or 4 a year at most. Wouldn't take a great number of trees to hold them down. And
so it does point to Europeans doing deforestation.
Yeah, and the fact that most of the statues, I think it's about 4,000, 2,000 of them hadn't been moved. They were still whether in situ, where they've been carved. There's about 2,000 that had been erected over those 800 years before the Europeans got there. So it's a fascinating documentary.
Yeah. Let's watch it.
Yeah, I would recommend it if you're at all interested in that sort of thing. But thank you for.
That's okay. Actually, I do have just one more thing to say about this, because usually people say, well, how come the passenger became extinct? And it was killed in unimaginable numbers. Apparently, you could stand on a low hilltop and bat them out of the air with a stick. because they were so deep when they were flocking over. But it was mainly due to the roosting sites, which were so easy to destroy with dynamite and just deforesting generally. Apparently, one of the biggest sites was around the Great Lakes area, and I think it was 700 square miles. It was virtually thick with passenger pigeons nesting, and they nested and laid simultaneously, and apparently only laid one egg a year. And they had to be in large numbers for reproductive success. So taking even quite a lot of them to zoos was no good at all. They could only work as a species in vast numbers. And apparently they completely controlled the ecosystems, these passenger pigeons. They were basically these species, again I've forgotten the word, the keystone, that's right, keystone species. And they specialised on the acorns of the white oak. They couldn't apparently eat the acorns of the red oak, which are rather bigger. And since they've been exterminated, the whole ecosystem has changed as a result of the different tree species that now grow that couldn't grow.
I have a question about the long-term effects. Has anyone modelled the long-term trajectory of this process occurring on, and what would be the effect on biodiversity on the planet? Does the planet actually mind about this happening at all?
Well, you're talking about the diet.
Well, I wasn't, but yes, that's true. Yes, yes.
I know there haven't been studies done. But there surely must be, because ecosystems are so dependent on the interactions. And so if you take a very important organism away or introduce completely alien, it's bound to have long-term effects. Yeah.
One last question, please.
Sorry. Somebody behind.
Do you know at all what the plan is with the snails in Hawaii? Have they given up, or are they going to try something else?
As far as I know, they haven't had success. I do know that there are some parasitic worms that are pretty good at getting rid of snails. So whether they try that, I don't know. And whether there's a giant glowworm or something like that. Glowworms are very good at getting rid of snails in our country, but I don't know what the natural predators in Africa are for these snails.
I think we should probably draw the conclusion that there's plenty more that we need to know about invasive species, and probably we're not going to solve it tomorrow or the next day. Thanks very much to Ben for a terrific talk.